This is the final word. Story time number 133. Why is this happening? Geoff Lemon, Adam Collins, and Bharat Sundaresan all here. Why are we here on a Monday? This is normally a weekend show. Why are we here on Monday, the 24th of April? A date that we've talked about on the show before for a couple of different reasons. And on story time, I think it's probably fair to say that we sometimes take the piss out of people. Most of them are dead. Some of them are still alive. But maybe somebody who has been part of the show and who didn't know that they were part of the show for a very long period of time. Maybe there's one particular person who's been more part of the show than most, I suppose. And so today, of all days, it seemed like after having some fun with this person over the last couple of years, maybe it was time to show them a little bit of respect on one day. For the first and possibly only time that we will say this seriously, happy birthday, Sachin.
Sachin.
It's your birthday. Happy birthday.
Sachin. Sachin.
It's your birthday. Happy birthday.
Sachin.
Take it away, Lise.
Take it away, Geoff.
Adam Collins, welcome to the show, our special story time edition. Nice to see you on a Monday.
This was a good idea from you. I share your contention that not that we've been too harsh on Sachin. He's probably opened himself up to us with the birthday tweets and all the rest of it. We've had fun with it. But we wouldn't be doing it unless there was an enormous amount of respect to start with and due deference on his 50th birthday. So, yes, the 24th of April is a day that we've spoken about before in reference to when he was a man of half this age, Desert Storm. I'm sure that'll come up at some point through our conversation. But 25 years on from Desert Storm, we record this podcast.
And Bharat, you are a Mumbai lad yourself. You grew up in the town thereof. You're almost contemporaries. You're a decade and a bit behind Sachin in terms of birthdays, but you know he's basically been a part of your life for as long as you can remember.
Oh, absolutely. From the day I was born, and I also played cricket in Shivaji Park, like most kids growing up in Mumbai wanted to. Not because Shivaji Park was the best place to play cricket in, not because it was very close to where I lived, because that's where Sachin Tendulkar played cricket. And so, if you wanted to play cricket, you found a way to get to Shivaji Park. But you're right. I mean, the story of Sachin is something I've lived through it, like my whole generation has. But it's a story that will be told and retold in classrooms and households in India. And ever since you told me, Geoff, that we'll be recording this, I've been trying to rack my brains around what Sachin Tendulkar means to India and means to us. And at times, especially for someone like me who's been with cricket for so long, been part of the industry, covered a lot of Sachin Tendulkar's career, at least the last 6, 7 or 8 years, you almost started taking for granted what Sachin meant to you, because he was just he was synonymous not just with cricket, but he was synonymous with India for the longest time. At least for kids growing up, going to school, Sachin meant India, and no wonder he always made sure that even on his helmet, he had the Indian flag over the BCCI logo and all sorts of things. But and Sachin Tendulkar birthdays meant special moments for all of us because there were so many cricketing anecdotes involved, or which would get played out on Tendulkar's birthday. And a few years ago, actually 10 years to the day, a cousin of mine became a father for the first time. And the first thing he said was not the fact, and in India you can't find the gender, right? It's illegal to do that. It wasn't about, oh, it's a boy or it's a girl. It was, oh, my child was born on April 24th, Sachin Tendulkar's birthday. So it's a good way of bringing in your child. It happened to be a girl, and we are celebrating her birthday in this very house in Adelaide in a couple of days' time. And we just raise a toast to Sachin Tendulkar as well.
Well, I have to say, this was not my idea. So due credit to a listener of ours, Rahul Venkat, who wrote to me a week or two ago and said, are you thinking about doing anything for the day? It was actually his idea. He said, maybe you should think about a Sachin story time. And I said, absolutely, we will. So thank you, Rahul Venkat, for coming up with this idea. Storytime's all about the numbers. Let's start with a couple of the headline numbers from the career of Sachin Tendulkar, who played from 1989 until 2014. 24 years in international cricket. And basically, by dint of that, the bulk of that career, the volume of that career, has more of just about everything than just about everyone. More Test matches played, 200, made 15,921 runs, the most of all time. 51 hundreds, 68 50s in Test cricket, 329 innings, more than anybody. I like the fact that he only made 14 ducks in those 329 innings. So the one thing he doesn't have the most of is ducks. There are 88 players ahead of him with more than 14 ducks. So that gives you a sense of the difficulty of trying to get Tendulkar out. The most one-day internationals played as well, 463 of them, made 18,426 runs. Also the record. 4900s, still the record. 96 50s, still the record. 452 innings, 20 ducks in ODIs. So he's 13th on that list, not quite as far down. In all international cricket, 34,357 runs. He played one T20 as well, sneak that in there. So he's got 6,000 more runs than the next best candidate, which is Kumar Sangakkara. 664 matches all up for India, so 70 more than Sangakkara played in internationals. And if you assume that, say, it's a day for an ODI, and let's call it 4.5 days per test match, because you'd have some 3-dayers, you'd have some 5-dayers, you'd have the occasional abandoned one. If you said it was 4.5 days per test, that means he spent over 3 years and 9 months of his life on the field playing for India.
It's always impressive when you get that, how many days, how many hours, especially with players like Tendulkar. Just wanted to ask Brett a question off the top about the one T20 international. I've seen that listed before and never actually clicked on the scorecard. What was the context around him getting his third international cap? Like, when was it? Who was he playing against? How did he go?
I think it was the game against South Africa, the first ever T20 international that India played on the 2006 tour of South Africa. India had, if you remember, were the last big team to embrace the format, and then we all know what happened ever since. But India was very reluctant, and in 2006 they played a solitary T20I, which had some guys who would a year later go on to win the first ever World T20 or the first ever TT World Cup, as Ravi Shastri called it on commentary, in South Africa. But it all started with that one-off T20I, which I don't think Tendulkar did much in that game from memory.
He made 10.
He made 10. There you go. 10 for Tendulkar. It's a forgotten T20 international. Like, it's before MS Dhoni became MS Dhoni and India really took T20 World or T20 cricket took India by storm. He won himself a cap. Not as dramatic as Rahul Dravid winning that crazy T20I cap in 2011, hitting a six and saying, well, I never wanted to play this format anyway, or never expected to get a T20I cap, I retire. So he made his debut and retired from one format on the same day, or the same evening, I should say.
That's Shahid Afridi energy there. Debuting and retiring on the same day. All right, so here is how we're going to do this episode. We're going to play a game called Nerd Pledge, but it is not quite like Nerd Pledge that you've played before. Here is how it normally works. People fund this program by sending in contributions in a monetary form in an amount that relates to cricket. It's not a normal round number, it's a very specific number, and it relates to cricket, and we try to work out what the number means. Now, today we know that the answers to all of the questions are Sachin Tendulkar in one way or another. And so normally when you send in a Nerd Pledge, they go in a list. They're purely sequential. It's first come, first served, and you can't sneak up the list unless you've got the same number as somebody above you, and maybe we do that in a combined answer. Today, we've looked at the entire list and we've picked out some numbers that we think can relate to something that we want to talk about. So this is reverse engineered Nerd Pledge, which means that if your name is coming up today, there's a very good chance that this is not the answer to the riddle that you were trying to send us. But nonetheless, you're on this program. You're entitled to a revisit in the future, and we will come to you in time.
Whether you want it or otherwise, though, it might be the case that you get your number linked to the Sachin show, which I've just got a feeling might be pretty well listened to, and you're happy with that, and you're happy with what the story that Brat or myself or you tell in the next couple of hours. We'll see.
Let us start with James Philbrook. You are our first Happy Birthday Sachin Nerd Pledger for the day, with a pledge of £2.66. 266 is the number. You can interpret the decimal point in any way you want. This is how Nerd Pledge works. Bharat, over to you.
Let's start from at the very start, the Sachin Tendulkar story, and all those numbers that you were just reading out, Geoff Lemon. They're mind-boggling, and they're mind-boggling every time you listen to them or hear someone talk about them. Even when they would pop up on the screen towards the end of his career when he would walk out to bat. And also, the other day I was looking at some stats of fastest to a certain number of runs in ODI cricket. It gets to 13,000, and after that it's just Tendulkar. 14,000, 15,000, 16,000, fastest to it. Because nobody's even gotten close to those numbers. But the strange thing is, now when I look back, it almost seemed predestined that he would break those records. There's this famous photo of Sunil Gavaskar, who was still playing for India, and Sachin Tendulkar. Sometime in the mid 80s, I'd like to say 1984, 1985, Sachin Tendulkar wins a schoolboy award, and Sunil Gavaskar sends him a handwritten note that you will break all my records. And it's amazing for someone to say that about a kid who's 14 at that point. This is before Sachin Tendulkar has even made his first class debut, which would happen, I think, a year or so after that. And Sunil Gavaskar mentions that, I know at this point he's got the most centuries in Test cricket, 34, and he says, no, you'll go past my record. And Sunil Gavaskar was at hand, as we will discover later, when Sachin Tendulkar does go past his record. And Sunil Gavaskar has been at every India game since. He retired anyway. So I think... And then the interviews of Sachin Tendulkar that started popping up. Obviously, I was too young to remember them. I was born in 1985, just when Sachin Tendulkar was breaking through. Sachin Tendulkar, the name. We all know about, at least you guys don't know. Like I said, even though we didn't read about them in our textbooks, we all know it by rote. The Achrekar contribution, his great famous coach who picks him up, who would take him all around Bombay on a scooter and make sure he played not just one game but many, many games. And the famous stories of leaving a coin on top of his stump in net sessions, and Sachin Tendulkar would get that 1 rupee coin. 1 rupee coin, imagine. Someone who would go on to make billions of dollars, but the thing that he treasures the most, those 1 rupee coins are still somewhere in his palatial house in Bandra. And he would get the 1 rupee coin if he didn't get out in that session. And similarly, if he did not get out in a match, he would get a rupee. The coach would give him that rupee. And of also stories of how, his parents, his dad was a writer. He grew up in this society called Sahitya Salvas in Bandra, not too far from the stinky lake that we took a tuk-tuk past, Geoff Lemon, you'd remember during your brief visit to Mumbai, somewhere in that region. And he starts playing cricket in Shivaji Park, but it gets too taxing for him, so he moves into his aunt's house. These are stories like every kid who grew up in the 90s and even in the 2000s knows by heart. You ask them about Shivaji or how India won India won independence. Well, not so sure, but Sachin Tendulkar, what happened in his early days, everybody knows, yeah. Or him having curly hair, wanting to be John McEnroe when he was growing up. He would apparently have a hairband and trouble all his older siblings to include him in all their games. He was always the baby of the society, and these are some of the stories. But there's this one interview which I'm guessing you guys would have seen, where a very young Sachin Tendulkar speaks to Tom Alter, one of the greatest actors, thespians in Indian history, father of Jamie Alter, who I'm sure both of you have met during your journey in cricket. And it's at Shivaji Park. This is around the time color TV is just coming through. So it's not color, it's somewhere between black and white and color. And this is a few months after in the Indian selectors decided not to take Sachin Tendulkar to the West Indies when he's still 15 years old, because they were genuinely scared for his safety. They were scared that Malcolm Marshall and Curtly Ambrose would hit him. And in that interview, Tom Alter asked him about it, and he's like, no, I'm ready. He's nervous, you can see that. He's got that thin mustache going as well. So he's this young kid just hitting puberty, speaking about, no, I'm okay to face Marshall and Curtly Ambrose. Whereas like you hear guys like Martin Crowe and Dean Jones and those guys who made their debut against these guys, and they would speak about these guys, these fast bowlers with dread, but not a 15-year-old Sachin Tendulkar. You can call it just the boldness of youth, but you could see that he was being genuine. And it just felt like he wasn't just one of those prodigies who would be a flash in the pan or not reach the heights that at that point nobody had imagined. Even now, it seems unimaginable. Some of the heights he reached in one-day cricket, those stats that you mentioned.
Like there are always these prodigy stories, right? There are always these school kids who come through and make 400 and something in schoolboy cricket or have these huge partnerships or whatever, and it usually doesn't work out, right? Like the kid who's that good at that age usually disappears.
Now, like there's this sort of culture building on what Geoff says of having a kid who's 5 or 6 in India who might be the next big thing, and seeing pictures of them and videos of them plastered all over social media. Is that, do you think, a consequence of the way Tendulkar was seen as a boy genius, and thus every parent of a prospective Indian player wants to get them out there so they might have a similar rise?
That and the rise of social media. All these clips you see of little kids playing the perfect front foot defense or the straight drive. I think social media has had a lot to do with it. But catching them young was a concept which was prevalent in India even before Tendulkar. People always speak about Vinod Kamli as being the failed prodigy because they came together, they had that big partnership. But Lakshman Sivaramakrishnan, who I'm sure you guys have heard on commentary, was drafted into the Indian side when he was just 17. He was the first prodigy of the 1980s. But things didn't work out. He had a great start, took a lot of wickets against India, but somehow it just didn't work out. But Sachin Tendulkar just seemed, as Ravi Shastri would famously or infamously say in one of his early interviews about Tendulkar in 1994, this kid was sent from upstairs to come down, play cricket, and go right back, which made him sound like an alien. But it just seemed different when people spoke about Sachin Tendulkar as a prodigy. Maybe it was the grounding, the fact that whenever he got an opportunity, not just at school level, but at the higher levels, when he was thrown into the deep end, he always came up trumps, whether it was when the Cricket Club of India, the Brabant Stadium, kind of said, oh, we can't allow anyone who's not 18 into our club premises, but there's this 15-year-old genius or 14-year-old genius who we want to see him play in front of us. So they kind of bend their rules, which they had never had, to allow this 14-year-old to come and play for their club. And he plays a game and makes 100, and everybody's like, wow. So everyone was awestruck, not just by the aura around him, but just the way he would bat, the hunger for runs. And that just stood out about him. So I think that's why, and it helped that Sunil Gavaskar, someone of his pedigree, who at that point was the greatest batter India had ever produced, would make this public statement that this kid will break my records. It doesn't happen very often, right? Especially when you're still playing cricket, you very rarely hear contemporary sports people kind of acknowledge a prodigy like the way Gavaskar did Tendulkar. And that's a special relationship and always has been. But yeah, wherever he went, he made runs. You all know about the famous debuts in the Ranji Trophy as a 15-year-old, the Irani Cup, the Duleep Trophy. He just made runs. And that's why the selectors were in a big quandary. The whole of India wanted them to just give this kid a go. He became such a national sensation. And also it helped that, like I said earlier, India was changing towards the end of the 80s, and we'll speak a lot more about it when we speak about Brand Tendulkar at some point, because we have to talk about the off-cricket or off-field influence of Sachin Tendulkar to India. But India was changing, and there was this whole push on the selectors, and I've heard stories about how the selectors sat around in a group. The late Raj Singh Dungarpur, who was the chief selector at that point, would love narrating this story about how Naren Tamhane, I'm sure Naren Tamhane has been on Storytime at some point, great former Indian wicketkeeper. He was also one of the selectors. He said, but what will people say about us? Raj Singh Dungarpur says in the selection committee room before the Pakistan tour, if we pick a 15-year-old kid in a test squad, it's 15. How do you pick a 15-year-old test squad and he fails? And then apparently Naren Thamane looked at Raj Singh Dungarpur and said, boss, it's Sachin Tendulkar. Sachin Tendulkar never fails. So that level of confidence from former cricketers, and cricketers, or people who are really good at what they do, they just have a different eye to the likes of even you and I, right? We follow cricket, we watch cricket, but a cricketer knows when a cricketer is special. And I think that's what kind of made Sachin Tendulkar different to every other prodigy, including some of the prodigies that he grew up with, like Vinod Kambli.
When Ravi Shastri says it sounds like he was sent down and then he's going to go straight back, it sounds like Ravi Shastri is going to kill him as soon as he finishes playing cricket. Maybe that was a motivation strategy, and maybe that's why Sachin played for as long as he did, because he was worried that as soon as he retired, Ravi's going to knock on the door and say, "I'm sorry, but I have to do this."
There was a running joke in India for a long time that maybe he'll get beamed up the way Ravi Shastri on air, as well as Sachin Tendulkar is being taken out, wherever he came to, back to wherever he came from. But coming back to the numbers, so he goes on this tour of Pakistan, where Waqar Younis also makes his debut on the opposing side. The first famous story to come out of the Sachin Tendulkar international cricketer story is when he gets hit on his nose in Sialkot by Waqar Younis, and there's a big gash on his nose. He's bleeding. And it's always believed that every mother in India at that point was weeping because there's this curly curly-haired little child playing Test cricket for India, but like he's bleeding on the cricket field against Pakistan with this menacing new fast bowler called Waqar Younis. Imran Khan and Wasim Akram also playing that game. That's a brutal bowling attack to make your debut again. Maybe he might have missed out on making his debut against Marshall and Ambrose 6 months prior, as a lot of people wanted him to, including him. But then this happens, but then that's a big moment, right? Like, what happens next? This boy child is bleeding on the cricket pitch. But then he shakes it off, just asks for some ointment that he applies on the side of his nose, and continues to bat, makes a 50, saves the day for India. And, that's it. The epic is in motion. And a few months later, he goes on his second tour. He's yet to make a big score. He's made 250s, 4 test match series back then against Pakistan. He makes 250s, goes to New Zealand, huge hype about Sachin Tendulkar. It's Bishan Singh Bedi is the coach at that point. And New Zealand want to see what this... wherever Sachin Tendulkar went, there was this curiosity, right? Like, everybody had heard about this wonder kid coming through the ranks from India. As John Wright, who would then go on to coach India, would say, I was keen to see like what this kid has to offer. He goes there, makes a few runs in the one-dayers, doesn't get too many in the first test in Christchurch, I think 0 in 24. And then they go to Napier. And also the fact that we think about the fact that he was facing Richard Hadley. So he makes his debut against Imran Khan, faces Richard Hadley in his second series. He's playing alongside Kapil Dev, and he's faced Kapil Dev in the nets when Tendulkar was just 14. And he faces Ian Botham in the 92 World Cup. It's like Tendulkar was around for so long that he started off against Hadley, Imran Khan, and he finished up against Shannon Gabriel. Just bizarre when you think about just how long that career was. I mean, it's easy to say, Sachin Tendulkar, longevity. But 24 years, that's a long time. But Richard Hadley to Shannon Gabriel, for me, just it's a great range.
There are many ways to sort of interpret that. One of my favourites is who dismissed Sachin Tendulkar in his first test innings in Australia at the SCG. Sorry, not at the SCG, rather at Brisbane. So his first test there, it's not a bad trivia question, actually. Do you remember who it was, Brett? Who knocked him over?
And the first, Mike Whitney?
Mike Whitney bowled him. So, Mike Whitney is now 64 years of age, right? And he made his test debut, famously at 1981, but it was him at the start. And, I mean, we'll come back to that, I'm sure. Also, how you referenced Ravi Shastri, we spend a lot of time talking about Shane Warne's debut in the context of Shastri, Shastri's double ton and all the rest of it. But, Sachin making 148 down at number 6. I know he'd already made a century in England, and you'll probably come back to that in a sec, in 1990. But his first ton against Australia was Shane Warne's first innings bowling in Test cricket. So, I mean, again, their stories are so intertwined the whole way through, but they do start there at the SCG.
But and that Tendulkar's career encompasses Shane Warne's whole career comfortably at either end. He's playing 3 years before Shane Warne's playing, and he continues for another 7 years after Shane Warne finishes. and Shane Warne plays over 150 test matches and misses a bunch of them. He's got one of the more substantial test careers going around, and Tendulkar swallows it whole.
Ricky Ponting as well, if you think about it, right? Ricky Ponting... and it's amazing. Sachin Tendulkar was already a made man by the time Ricky Ponting makes his debut in '95. and he plays for another year, at least another summer after Ricky Ponting retires. It's bizarre. Glenn McGrath the same. That longevity itself could be an episode at some point. But going back to this New Zealand tour and this particular number, so they go to Napier. India are in trouble. Manoj Prabhakar is opening with W.V. Raman, who gets out first ball. Richard Hadley. Manoj Prabhakar just scratching around as he used to after he became this weirdly transformed opener who would not score too many runs. Sachin Tendulkar walks out at number 6. And at this point, he's still 16 years and 292 days old. So not only the youngest debutant India have ever had, but also if he gets close to 100, would have become the youngest Test centurion. And he starts playing this, arguably his best innings, Test innings at that point, in more challenging conditions away from the subcontinent. He's stroking Richard Hadley around. There are some clips of it online. You should check it out. There's this back cut he plays of Richard Hadley, and I mean, you think of Sachin Tendulkar's greatest shots, you think of McGrath and Dale Steyn, but not Richard Hadley. But yeah, he just plays this back cut of Richard Hadley, plays some great shots of Danny Morrison. And he's unbeaten on 80 overnight. I think there's a lot of rain around. So it's a boring draw overall. There's a lot of rain around. On day 3, all this hype, 16 years and 294 days old is Sachin Tendulkar. And the whole hype is about, New Zealand or the world is about to see the youngest ever Test centurion. Starts the day off beautifully, 2 more fours down the ground. And then in an attempt to play another uppish off drive, hits the ball straight to John Wright, who was New Zealand captain. It's at a wide-ish mid-off, and he's out for 88. And he does make his maiden Test centuries 5 or 6 months later in England, as Adam said. But by then, he's gone past Mushtaq Mohammed's age, which was 17 years and 78 days. So Sachin Tendulkar would have beaten it by quite a distance if he had got to 3 figures on February 12th, 1990. But he doesn't. He gets out for 88. And there's this cute little story about it as well. So, and when you see the replay of his dismissal and him walking off, the camera is on him, and you can see he's about 16 years old. So the emotions are beginning to burst through. You can see that his chubby cheeks are getting a little red, but he makes sure that nobody can see his eyes. And later on, he would confess that the first thing he did when he walked into the dressing room, he was consciously trying to not break down on the field because he's a Test cricketer, right? He's a big boy now. When he walks in, charges into the bathroom, and apparently just broke down. And it took him a while to recover. And then he gives this lovely little interview as well to one of the New Zealand commentators about how disappointed he was. And yes, I know. He says, yeah, I played really well, but I wanted to make a Test 100, and it's pretty sweet. I mean, young Sachin Tendulkar, who even at that point realized the importance of the milestone that he just missed out on. No wonder he created and broke so many milestones thereafter. But just the nerd pledge itself, he faced 366 balls in that innings. 266 balls in that innings to make his 88 and his first real impact innings in Test cricket, where everyone stood up and said, wow, this kid is this special. And everyone in England and Australia were getting really excited because not too long after, they were to host India in Test series.
So first of all, the number 88. He only got out once in the 90s to Australia. That was for 98, very deep into his career in 2010. The only other time he missed out was when he made 88 at the same ground in Mohali back in 2008. He seemingly was a guy who, well, when it mattered most, he realised that the milestone could have a psychological effect on the opposition. He wasn't the kind of guy who found himself in strife in the 90s too often.
Not really. And he would charge through the 90s as well. I mean, not in Virender Sehwag fashion, but there was a period in his career, I think in the mid-2000s, when things seemed to be going against Tendulkar, and I'm sure we'll come to that, where people would criticize him for slowing down as he neared the 100. Definitely once he got close to that 100th, which in itself felt like an epoch. A lot of us aged as we all waited for that 100th. So did he, in his own confession. But yeah, that didn't happen too often. And it's the way he gets out after making 88 was kind of symbolic of how he would kind of go through those 80s and 90s later on in his career, and the reason why he made so many hundreds.
And that was from the start as well. So I touched on that first tour of Australia that Tendulkar makes and the 100 he makes at Sydney, and how it gets a little bit overlooked because of the Shastri emphasis. But the century at the Wacker later in the series, all pace attack. So he doesn't make a 50 in the series, just 2 tons. What is he? Is he even 19? I'm pretty sure he's 18 then, isn't he? But that 100 in Perth, that's the old-fashioned whacker, and you look at the all-pace attack, McDermott, Hughes, Rifle, Whitney, even Tom Moody, the all-rounders bowling seam up, and it always felt to me like the 100 at Perth was given more weight than the 100 at Sydney due to the degree of difficulty.
For an Indian batter, and also that came towards the end of the series where India was battered and bruised. It was a terrible tour for India, you'll remember. Sanjay Manjrekar had a lot of troubles against the bouncing ball. So did a lot of other batters. Yes, Ravi Shastri makes the double 100 in Sydney. But I think apart from Azharuddin making 100 in Adelaide, none of the other Indian batters really could matter. And it kind of came at Sanjay Manjrekar's peak. As a batter, he makes double hundreds in Pakistan, scores runs against the West Indies. But that Australia tour kind of stunted his test career. And it did the same to a lot of other Indian batters as well. But then for Sachin Tendulkar, the 18-year-old, to put his hand up and to make that 100 at the infamous whacker, also made him the best batter in the Indian side at 18. That doesn't happen very often in Test cricket. I mean, there have been young guys or peak batters or cricketers who started young playing Test cricket, but very rarely has an 18-year-old become the best batter in the side of a major team like India. And it was that whacker innings that just defined young Tendulkar. And I think I was watching clips of the Sydney 100. Greg Chappell, when he gets to 100, says, we're seeing the emergence of one of the shiny stars of world cricket, and we'll see a lot of him in the 90s. When Greg Chappell didn't realize that he himself would end up coaching him 16 years later, and that we would see a lot more of this emerging star for 21 years after he gets to that Sydney 100.
So that is the 266 for James Philbrook. It is the 266 deliveries faced by Sachin Tendulkar when he didn't quite become the youngest player to ever make a Test century. How do you like them apples, James? All right, Slim Johns is up next. This is actually a repeat. So a few weeks ago only, Slim Johns sent through $1.67 and said, find a story for me. I don't know what the answer is. Go and find it. And so this story fits too perfectly to leave out. This was me trying to find a one-day international innings with a strike rate of 167, and there have only been 2 in history. This was one. In 1994, when India play a one-day international in Auckland. Here's the interesting thing. India have just done New Zealand for 142, bowled them out. Should be an easy chase. But Navjot Singh Sidhu, who's the listed opener, has done his neck. He's tweaked his neck somehow and he can't turn his head. So he can't open the batting. They need a replacement to open the batting. And they decide to pop up the order a fellow named Sachin Ramesh Tendulkar. At this stage, Tendulkar is a month away from turning 21. He's played 70 ODIs by this point because he started so young, but he's got a middling record. He's batted in the middle order. He's never made 100. So Sachin isn't Sachin at this point.
Right.
He's just an okay middling ODI player. And you can tell this because I found some footage of this and it's clearly been copied across from a dodgy VHS tape because it's got lots of static and lines on the screen and whatever. I think it's Ian Smith, a young Ian Smith among the Kiwi commentators, but most of the commentators keep calling him Tendulkar. Oh, this Sachin Tendulkar.
Well, that's beautifully played by Tendulkar.
It's a good shot from Tendulkar. Good tactics too.
You know, Tendulkar's not Tendulkar, oils ain't oils, because nobody's popped into the box to say maybe you should change that vowel, baby John Burgess. So Tendulkar comes out to open and he just decides that mainly that he wants a piece of Gavin Larson, right? He's not going crazy at first, but he just starts driving him through the covers. He plays that back cut that you recognise from his whole career away through backward point. Some boundaries stack up. Larson's bowling to him and Tendulkar just walks at him and flat bats him back down the ground as a 20-year-old. Very quickly raises a half century from 34 balls. And I mean, this footage is crazy. Like, this sort of stuff does not happen in this era of cricket. He's playing the whip away through backward square leg. He's hitting down the ground, and he just seems to want to hit every ball to the boundary, and he's hitting most of them to the boundary. 51 off 34 balls comes up, at which point a guy runs out of the crowd, runs to the middle of the ground and kisses Tendulkar on the cheek. Tendulkar is not happy about this. He's sort of wiping his face afterwards because he's basically been headbutted by a very enthusiastic India fan. A couple of others run out and pat him on the back and whatnot, and then get sent off again. It's all very different. You know, nobody crash tackles them and beats the shit out of them like the way that would happen these days. Then he really starts going after Gavin Larson. He shuffles and just hits him off the top of the bounce with a back foot drive for 6 down the ground. I mean, extraordinary shot. He charges and plays a square drive through backward point while 3 metres down the pitch. He even tries an early prototype lap sweep of the kind where you get down in position early and wait for it, that one that, you know, Tendulkar was pioneering even at that point. He gets to 82. They've still got 26 to chase, and he needs 18 for 100. He's got Vinod Kambli, his old mate, batting very quietly at the other end. And then he shapes to play a sweep shot, ends up trying to defend it with a straight bat, gets a little leading edge to a very off-Broadway left-arm orthodox bowler named Matthew Hart, who takes a return catch. 82 from 49 balls, which, as I said, in the era, astonishing attacking batting.
Yeah.
With that strike rate of 167.3, he goes on to open the batting 339 more times in one-day cricket after that day. That is the day that makes Sachin, because from that point on, he is India's opener. For years after that, he's India's opener. He dips down into the middle order occasionally in the later part of his career, but ends up back at the top by the end. He is the quintessential Indian one-day international opener, 340 hits at the top of the order out of the 400 plus one-day games that he played. And the other little bit of provenance in terms of what this created, and I think this might be, I wonder if this is it. I'm not sure who the commentator was. I couldn't recognise the voice. But after he brings up the half century, one of the commentators says, he's enjoying that contest out there. He's just showing them who the master is.
Well, you know, I feel he's playing with the bowlers. He's enjoying that contest out there. He's just showing who the master is.
And I
Imagine having that claim to fame and not even knowing it's you. Like the commentator, we have to maybe send it my way on YouTube so I can see if I can work out who it is, and if not that, then we can send it to Coney, and maybe he'll know, because it could well be being back into India. A headline writer in India has picked up on that, and the rest is history. It could be.
That was the replay. We're back live, and we did solve the mystery of who did the commentary as well, Adam.
We did. I'm glad this came back up. Tanya Wintringham, who's one of our great supporters and correspondents, sent me a message after hearing the episode. She went back and listened to it. Now, she's a very close follower of all things New Zealand cricket. Early Ian Smith was lovely, the first couple of minutes, so it's good to hear TV commentary. And it's none other than Bob Kunis. She can confirm that it's most certainly Bob Kunis who was the man who dubbed him the master to begin with, which I think's a nice postscript to this, that a commentator whose name had come up before in another context by Daniel Norcross and has been said, well, I say Daniel Norcross, it was John Arlott originally, but Norcross regaling us with that story, only to come up in reference to the little master Sachin Tendulkar many years later.
And he speak of Sachin Tendulkar's one-day numbers. And everybody talks about Sachin Tendulkar, the one-day phenomena, after he started opening the batting in that famous innings, which I remember vividly, waking up very, very early in the morning. And when we saw Sachin Tendulkar walk out to bat, we were shocked. And I remember my father saying, something must be wrong. Maybe it's highlights of some other game. Sachin Tendulkar can't be opening, but he was. And it got me thinking, or it sent me back in time to look at Sachin Tendulkar's early one-day numbers. We all know he started off with 2 zeros, and it's always been used as a comparison, right? When you're low in life, that's all right. Even Sachin Tendulkar started with 2 zeros, is something we heard all throughout our childhood. And what really caught my eye was the rate at which he was scoring runs in his first few ODIs. He was batting at 6. He was always in between Mohammad Azharuddin and Kapil Dev, the two senior heads. Mohammad Azharuddin wasn't as senior as Kapil Dev, but he was already captain or about to become captain in the late 80s. And some of Sachin Tendulkar's innings stood out. He makes 36 of 22, or before that, his first innings is 31 of 26. His first major contribution in one-day cricket. Him and Mohammad Azharuddin chased down a massive total by those standards in England. In Trent Bridge, I think they chased down 282, which for the longest time was India's highest run chase before they broke the world record, in 1998, Rishikesh Kanetkar hitting that boundary of the last ball against Pakistan. But you rewind it even further, he makes 36 of 22 against Sri Lanka, then follows it up with 53 of 41 against Sri Lanka, his first ever player of the match performance, also takes 2 for 39, and in the next game reels off 30 of 29. And after his first 11 ODIs, Sachin Tendulkar, this is back in 1989-1990, he had a ODI strike rate of 100.85, which is staggering for that time. So, yes, he's making his name in Test cricket, but he's also not just taking one-day cricket by storm. He's also pioneering this really aggressive late middle order aggression, and he's pioneering it. And for the longest time, I think till the 1992 World Cup, his strike rate was in the mid to high 90s. And then it starts dropping, and then he becomes an opener. So that trajectory is rarely spoken about with his one-day career.
Yeah, and the other bit you can slot in there, Bharat, is when he went to number 4. So that long tour of 91, 92, he played 14 one-day international innings across the Tri-Series and the World Cup, and only failed to make it 23 times. He was super consistent, in and around 50. He made about 4 half-centuries, but it kind of reinforces your point that they were building a one-day side around him before he went up to open for 15 years after that.
So from the point where he goes up to open, he bats 386 more times. He hasn't made a one-day 100 up until that point. So he makes all of them from that point. 386 innings, 132 times above 50. So better than 1 in 3 innings, he tops 50 in one-day cricket after that. His complete career rate of matches per 100 was 9.2, but after the time when he goes up to open for the first time, it's 7.8. And that's the absolute best. That's the runaway leader for so long. Eventually Kohli comes along, who's still scoring them at 5.7 innings per ton. Ryan Tendulkar, the other Tendo, at 6.4 innings per 100. Hashim Amla 6.7, Quinton de Kock 8.2. So there are a few modern players who get up there with it, but he was just so far ahead of his time. It was interesting that Sharjah's the only time he made back-to-back hundreds in one-day cricket. Never did it another time. Makes the first double 100 as well, and always seemed a chance. Like for years you thought, well, if someone's going to do it, it's probably Tendulkar at the top of the order, with the full 50 overs to play with. Got out for 99 3 times and got out 17 times in the 90s. So didn't have as much of a problem in Test cricket, but did get out in the 90s a lot in one-day cricket. So could have had another 20 hundreds if his conversions had been a little better. There's one not out in the 90s, 96 not out in Cuttack. They need 13 to win. He's 9 short of 100. And Dinesh Karthik comes out and hits a 6. What are you doing, DK? Put it away. So then they need 7 to win. And the only way Sachin can get to 100 is to go 4 and 6. So he scores the 4 and then just takes a single down to deep third, as though saying, oh, well, I don't want to seem greedy. I'm not going to try to slog it over the fence.
And there was this inevitability to him making one-day hundreds after he broke that drought. And it wasn't like Rohit Sharma and his one-day career where I think we had to wait, 98 ODIs before he made that first one-day century, because one-day centuries was still rare till the mid-90s. I remember the moment very vividly when Sachin Tendulkar went past Desmond Haynes' record of 17 ODI 100s. It felt like a huge number at that point. You kind of were amazed by how consistent Desmond Haynes should have been in the 80s to have made 17 ODI 100s, so far ahead of everyone else. The scoring rate was much slower, as we know, and 150 over cricket or 55 over cricket or 60 over cricket, whatever form of one-day cricket you were playing in your respective country, was still a big deal. But it really changed after Tendulkar, and he did it in different partnerships as well. Sachin Tendulkar, the one-day opener, the first version I remember is him and Jadeja were really, really successful. And then Jadeja gets pushed to the middle order. There was that really consistent run with Navjot Singh Sidhu, which continued through the 1996 World Cup and beyond. And then of course, the coming together of Ganguly and Tendulkar, which, for the longest time was the benchmark for opening in one-day cricket.
And it just corresponds so nicely, Baz, with the time that it felt like India were playing like 50 one-day internationals a year. I'm not sure if they ever actually hit 50 in a year, but it felt like it. And for me anyway, the pre-cable television era, in the back of the Melbourne tabloid, the Herald Sun, they'd have the box scores every day on cricket around the world. And, it felt like every other day you'd pick up the newspaper and Tendulkar was making a century at the top of the list for India in a one-day international. It's a really nice memory of mine, being a kid obsessed with all things cricket, that there was a familiarity with what was going on in India through that mid-90s period when one-day cricket was everything.
Our next cab, it is Tim Minchin, not that Tim Minchin, who's been on Storytime recently, but he's got the right number to go around again. The chips are falling his way. It is $3.83, the number. And so with 383 in hand, Adam, it's all yours.
Yeah, and this will go to eventually the great rivalry between Australia and India through this stretch of time that spans Tendulkar's career, making the documentary for the greatest season that was back a few years ago now, The Final Frontier. It was a reminder to Brett Egg and Shannon Gill and myself the extent to which India and Australia's rivalry is a modern phenomenon, and the very fact that Tendulkar has to wait between 91-92 and 99-2000 to play a test series in Australia goes to that. So they're playing a lot more one-day cricket, and we'll go through that. But yeah, this is a rivalry that we think of as being paramount now, and it is. But it wasn't. And it's taken time to evolve, and Tendulkar's right in the guts of that. He puts Indian cricket, not so much on the map, that would be downplaying what came before it. 83 World Cup is that kind of moment, really. Yeah. But for that generation, Tendulkar being a colossus, and Bradman, I think, as early as 1996, saying that then Tendulkar was the batsman that most reminded him of himself, I reckon, was the quote, something like that. Does that ring a bell to you? Bradman said something along those lines when he was a pretty young guy.
Yeah, he calls his wife over while he's watching cricket, and he says, that guy reminds me of, that was the famous anecdote anyway.
So we've already gone through a little bit of what happened in 91, 92, and I don't propose backing over that, and especially the start to his one-day career that Geoff went into some depth there. But I reckon the next big moment to lean to is that game at the Wankhede, the work, rest and play, your home ground, Bharat, Sachin's home ground, 96 World Cup. It's the Damien Fleming match in many ways, our colleague from Radio Baz. But Tendulkar getting 90 from 84 and then being stumped from the bowling of Mark Waugh with his new little off-breaks that he brought to that World Cup was the turning point in the match. So we think of India's campaign ending in the semi-final and burning down the stadium and forfeiting that game to Sri Lanka. But Tendulkar at the 96 World Cup makes all those hundreds. Doesn't quite get there against Australia, but I think that opened Australian eyes to what this kid was going to be.
Oh, I was there at the Wankhede when that game played out. And also, we spoke of Damien Fleming. Happy birthday, Damien Fleming as well. Don't forget, two other World Cup winners were also born on April 24th, Damien Fleming and umpire Kumar Dharmasena. Well, there you go. So, it's etched in my head when Mark Waugh bowls that wide, because it happened so quickly, and it was Sachin Tendulkar at his peak. I mean, there are so many ways to look back or think of Sachin Tendulkar, the batter, but rarely does Sachin Tendulkar, the destructor or the destroyer of bowling attacks, get mentioned. I mean, it's generally the numbers and the stats, but there was a period in the mid-90s, I think from say 96 to 99, 2000, where he was just taking down bowling attacks, and that was an example of that. I mean, stepping down to Glenn McGrath and smashing him, hitting Shane Warne over the top of his head. It was by far the innings of that tournament till that point, and it was the other guy in that World Cup who made 300s like Tendulkar, Mark Waugh, who bowls that wide. And for a second, we were sitting side on, and we weren't sure why Sachin Tendulkar was walking off. Like, we saw the umpire signal wide, and there was all this confusion. And I'm not kidding, Adam and Geoff. As before Sachin Tendulkar had gone into the Wankhede Stadium, the old Wankhede Stadium dressing room, which was on the ground floor, half the audience had left. There was still quite a bit of cricket left in that game. Half the audience had left. I convinced my dad that we needed to stay back because who knows? Quietly, as the non-Indian fan, I was happy, but still, I'll get lynched. But it was.
It was still a fair bit of cricket. That wicket falls when they're about 140 for 4. They're only chasing about 260, but we all know how that ends with Flem. And Flem sharing the birthday with Sachin, which is today, of course, and bowling to Sachin at Desert Storm on his birthday too.
Exactly. Yeah.
A couple of years on from that. Before that, though, is the Delhi Test match of '96. I started my answer by referring to how little Test cricket these nations played in the early part of the 90s. The very fact that it was a one-off Test match, and Tendulkar has just become captain. Was that his first captain in charge of the Test team? It's not a great record. He led India for a fair chunk of time between 96 and 99. Not all the time, but different points in time. They won 16% of Test under him and 31% of one-day internationals, which, when you consider the trajectory Indian cricket was on, the fabulous players at their disposal, isn't as good as it should be. But they win at Delhi under his leadership by 7 wickets. Naya Mongia, the makeshift opener, making that big 150. Who got Sachin Tendulkar out in the first innings? I did that little trivia question before about 91, 92 at Brisbane, but we often, Geoff, I might throw this to you, we often say, which bowlers got Tendulkar out as their first wicket in Test cricket? Well, there's one here. Delhi 96, who was it?
Delhi 96, first wicket's too early for Gavin Robertson.
Peter McIntyre.
That's right.
Although I think they might be wrong, Baz, in hindsight. Didn't McIntyre play a Test in 94, 95 at Adelaide? Didn't he?
He did.
That must be his first overseas wicket.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but nobody remembers that first Test. Everybody remembers Peter McIntyre's second Test, that one, because Brad Hogg was the one making his debut alongside him. And nobody in India had heard of either. What happened to Shane Warne? Who are these two?
Well, this is it, isn't it? The fact that Warne wasn't playing was more a talking point than who was. But yes, he missed out in the second dig as well. They were only chasing 58. They win, but he makes a duck, knocked over by McGrath. So at this stage, Sachin versus Australia in Test cricket had yet to kick up an extra gear. So it kind of takes Desert Storm, which is after the 98 series and is out of sequence, but when the rivalry goes to the next level, 25 years ago to this day, the 24th of April, 1998. 143 followed by 134 in the Sharjah sandstorm. The first was setting up a win, the second in the final of the Coca-Cola Cup, chasing down 273. We've had Harsha Bhogle on the final word and on the greatest season it was, talking about those innings in the past and how masterful they were. The second was from 131 balls with 12 fours and 3 sixes. So, you measure that against 1996 standards. So you measure that against 1998 standards, and it's blisteringly fast. But yeah, it isn't long after that 98 Test series, and I think of that getting home from school and just watching India bat for day after day after day. They only played 3 Test matches, but in the mind's eye, it feels like they played about 17 Tests with Navjot Singh Sidhu, a young VVS Lakshman, middle of his career, Tendulkar, Azharuddin, that extraordinary century he made in that series as well. But Tendulkar averages 112 with 446 runs in 5 hits. He's not captain at this point. Azharuddin is back, so it suits Tendulkar dropping back to being one of the ranks. But he did play a crucial innings in the first Test. Now, we only recently talked about this first Test match where Australia got off to a pretty good start. They took a first innings lead of 80-odd into the second half of the Test, thanks to Ian Healy and Gavin Robertson. We spoke about the Robbo hand recently. Then India in the third innings of the match smash 418 for 4 in just over a day to change the energy entirely. Sachin, which became a man of the match, 155 not out in 191 balls with 4 sixes. And the thing was, he went after Warne. So Warne in the first innings gets him out, caught at slip, I reckon, Mark Taylor. I can see your hands there, Baz. It must be caught at slip. That was a Friday night, and I remember my parents took me to Pizza Hut, and I had the earpiece in listening to the transistor radio as Warne gets Tendulkar. Must have been like 8 o'clock at night or something like that. That's my memory of it anyway. But the second innings, Tendulkar turned the match on its head, and he made another century at Bangalore, 177. They lost that match thanks to Mark Taylor and Kaspovic and Mark Waugh and so on. But nevertheless, Tendulkar was the player of the series in that 1998 contest. So that is, I reckon, when it's properly baked in, inked in, that it was going to be Tendulkar against 20 million Australians. And the fact that he'd enjoyed this success against Warne especially, we didn't know Warne's shoulder was cooked at that point, and that became more of the story through 1998. But, he had convincingly taken honours in that series, not only against Warne, but against all of the Australian bowlers used.
Tony Greig's famous line from that Sharjah game, even though it was of the medium pace of Tom Moody, but him just saying, the little man has hit the big fella for 6. I mean, that was played on commentary promos for at least 20 years thereafter. Because even though he was talking about the big fella and Tom Moody, this is Sachin Tendulkar taking down the mighty Australians. And he did it so many times in that year 1998, like you was just... like you said, Adam, from the start of 1998 to the end of 1998. And you're right, 1998 becomes the year of Tendulkar versus Australia and the year of India versus Australia. And through the 80s and 90s, Australia kind of disregarded India as a cricket team in terms of touring and hosting them. It rarely happened. And a year later, of course, Tendulkar leads the side, the test team, and they get smashed 3-0 99-2000, the debut of Brett Lee, and he still makes that famous 100 in Melbourne where he wakes up with a stiff back. He's not sure whether he can walk out to bat, but he says, no, I'm going to brave it. It's the MCG, it's the G. And so he finishes the that tour with having made hundreds now in Sydney, the WACA, and the MCG, all in the 90s, but spread across 9 or 10 years.
That 99-2000 summer, even though India get absolutely smashed, there's always, every time Tendulkar comes out to bat, there's this, like, the whole Australian crowd response is, well, he could do it today. Today might be the day. Like, there was always anxiety about what he might do. And I think even going into the 2001 series, it seemed like there was so much Tendulkar focus from the Australian team. Like in Mumbai, he makes 70, doesn't he? And when he gets out for 70, it's like, well, that's not enough. Tendulkar has to make 150, 170 for India to be a chance. But because they're so focused on him, and he gets out for 10 in both innings, doesn't he, in Kolkata, it's like they're so Tendulkar focused that Laxman and Dravid are able to sneak up on them. Ganguly's able to sneak up on them because all of the attention is going on to this one player.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll loop back around to that series in a sec. I just wanted to kind of note that in the middle of all of that as well, that there's the 99 World Cup Super 6 match at the Oval, which it bolsters your point, Geoff, that when Tendulkar's out in the first over, which is Glenn McGrath, isn't it? First over of that. When McGrath gets the new ball back, remember? It was, McGrath bowling first change with the White Dukes, whether he could control it enough and all this other bullshit. And they give him the new ball for the match against India, gets rid of Tendulkar. They're 4 for 17, quarter of an hour later. And like Australia went to bed as one. We after making 282, it was their best performance with the bat so far of that World Cup. Like, India, Tendulkar's out. They're 4 down. We know Australia are going to win. It'll all be okay. So, that 99-2000 series, Geoff, is on the back of Tendulkar missing out. And all of this added attention on will he, won't he? And you're right, like, the game, the match at Adelaide, the first test of that series, most India fans, I reckon, Baz, are still complaining about Daryl Harper's leg before or arm before wicket decision, which happened late of an evening in a day's play anyway, just when India were trying to hold on. It didn't affect the result in the end. India were soundly beaten and they got smashed up on the fifth and final morning. But the very idea that if Tendulkar got out to a dodgy decision, and it wasn't the only one in the series, was it? He was given out leg before to McGrath another time as well, I reckon it was. And there was a sense that he was getting a rough run in Oz, but Adelaide especially, arm before wicket. I don't know how many clicks Robert Linda's got on that YouTube video, but I've got a pretty good idea where most of them come from.
One of the first people I interviewed when I moved to Adelaide in 2018 was Daryl Harper, and the first thing he said was, I still shudder to get into an Uber in Adelaide because I see the name of the Uber driver, invariably it's an Indian guy, and the moment he sees me, the first thing he brings up is that Tendulkar, India hasn't forgiven me yet. So even
That's
though
so
kind of MS Dhoni played a big role in towards the end of, or for ending Daryl Harper's test career kind of prematurely, India have forgotten that. It's a Tendulkar dismissal that keeps popping up all the time. And this was peak, not hatred for Australia, but Australia were looked at as the enemy, right? They were the evil enemy. And that dismissal became the face of Australia being evil. Not just the players, but the umpires as well.
Yeah, this came up in a podcast I was listening to before this series that we were covering in India. There were I won't say which one, I don't want to get in trouble, but the analyst was using this particular series, 99-2000, as to why Australians were just scumbags. I'm like, whoa, hold your horses here. It's a fucking game of cricket. Anyway, but there you go. Just on white ball stuff, I like mentioning 99 World Cup, I don't propose going through the whole white ball rivalry with Australia, but 2003 World Cup as well. Gillespie blows his pad off with a fabulous piece of bowling, a slower ball in the group game. And so Tendulkar misses out there and Australia pump India. In the final, much as it was at the Oval in 99 in the Super 6 game, Tendulkar skying it up in the air. They need Sachin to make like half of the 360 they're set if they're any chance of winning realistically. And when he falls, they're never gonna get there, out for 4 in the first over. So bookending 2 World Cup cycles with McGrath getting out, Sachin Tendulkar making sure that Australia would go on to win both of those trophies. But yeah, the Test rivalry. You mentioned the 100 at the MCG. You look at the scorecard, right? At the G, this is. Tendulkar's made 2 scores. He's down the other end for the Brett Lee demolition job on Test debut. India are beaten by a mile, and yet Tendulkar's still player of the match. It's very rare to be player of the match in a Test match in a losing team anyway, but even rarer when you're flogged as they were there. And he's responsible for leading that side as well. They end up losing the series convincingly. They're beaten in Sydney as well, where he misses out, which is rare for Tendulkar, as we know, as we've already touched on. He loved batting on the Sydney cricket ground. He made another unbeaten 100 there in one-day cricket in 2008 before the run he goes on, or in the middle of that run he goes on in Test cricket on that ground. But the next series they play against each other at Test level is 2001. The 10 and the 10, so he doesn't quite get going at Calcutta, but he does take 3 for. He did still play his role in the final afternoon. That included, of course, completing the Adam Gilchrist King pair, offies, leggies, wrong-uns, couple of darts of medium pace. Like, he was such a gifted cricketer, Tendulkar, with the ball as well as the bat, that he played his role in the Calcutta miracle, even if it wasn't with bat in hand, having missed out both times, 10 and 10. And of course, he didn't miss out in the final Test match, a century at Chennai, that always comes up as one of his greatest.
Oh, and just on that 2001 series, I remember again being at the Wankhede when he makes that 70-odd in the second innings. And I watched a lot of cricket and covered a lot of cricket at the Wankhede. I don't remember the Wankhede being as noisy as it was during that afternoon session. And I remember going that day with a friend and a cousin of mine who's much older. And I remember at one point my friend and I were excitable young teenagers. We were up and down, getting really excited. And my friend said, like, so your cousin, he's kind of dull, isn't he? He doesn't get excited about anything at the cricket. I said, yeah, I mean, he's paying for the ticket, so I had to bring him along, or he brought me along. And at one point, I remember Sachin Tendulkar hits consecutive 4s, and I turned to my left. My cousin's on top of the seat. I mean, he must have been in his late 30s at that point, and jumping on the seat. And my whole, I'd never seen him excited about anything in life, and never after that, except during that 45 minutes or so. It was sensational batting, and also because that series had been hyped so much even before it began. It was like of the final frontier and all of that. And to see Tendulkar bat like that, and of course we know how he gets out, comes off the helmet, Justin Langer and Ricky Ponting takes that great catch. But I don't think the Wankhede has been as noisy in my experience as it was for 35 minutes or so. But it was just breathtaking batting and Tendulkar at his peak.
Yeah, it's analogous to Australia and England in 2005, I reckon, that Wankhede Test match, because India lose, the home side lose, but they come back ferociously, and they shown enough at Mumbai, and it was Tendulkar, a couple of half centuries there, even if it didn't pay off. And mentioned before what happens at Calcutta. Well, we've all been talking about it for 22 years now. Before Harbhajan goes to work and they win the Border Gavaskar in stunning circumstances by 2 wickets. 2003-04, very different feel than 99-2000 because of what happened in 2001, the Ganguly-Steve Waugh rematch, Steve Waugh's final series and so on. Ganguly gets the 100 at Brisbane, but Tendulkar out-league before wicket again to Gillespie for naught on this occasion. So, I wouldn't say he's under enormous amounts of pressure, but when you fold in him yet to make it to 50 until Sydney, which is the final test of the series, that was so unusual for Tendulkar at that stage of his life when he was making runs for fun, that he could go through 3 test matches in a row and not score, only to then rock up at Sydney and play a true all-timer, an unbeaten 241 out of 705 for 7 across 190 overs. He was out there for most of them, 613 minutes, 10 hours, 436 deliveries, 33 fours, and I thought that was nice that it's the same number of boundaries that Sobers hit for the rest of the World 11 against Australia at the MCG, the 254 that we spoke about a few weeks ago. Appropriate comparisons there, I reckon, that 2 all-timers, Sobers and Tendulkar, both hit 33 fours against Australia in their high scores against that opposition. And he added 353 with Lakshman for the 4th wicket. And I was there that day on day 2. In fact, all days of that test. But day 2 stands out in the memory because it was the first time, I reckon, I've seen the Australian crowd really turn on the Aussie Test team in that era. There was so much built-up frustration, and that was a function of Tendulkar being a sea of calm, batting with Lakshman, who played a superlative innings, driving down the ground at will, and that pair just taking away any realistic chance Australia had of winning the Test. And, yeah, sure, retrospectively, we say, well, they could have chased down 443 had they had more of a crack on the final day. But the real story there is that they missed a chance to win in Australia, India. They had 95 overs to bowl them out, and they fell 4 wickets short. And that would have been, I think, a fitting result given the way that India, with the exception of Melbourne, pretty much outplayed Australia, and it was in no small part due to Tendulkar stepping up big time at the SCG again.
Well, especially given the way they came back in Adelaide as well. And that's the series that really feels like the heavyweight bout in that era. Like, that's when India have a team that's backing up Tendulkar, because you've got the previous visit where nobody else can really come to the party. There's the Lakshman 100 in Sydney, of course. But in that series, you know, Dravid can do the job, Lakshman can do the job, Ganguly can do the job. There's enough around him that he's able to have a couple of bad tests and then still come to the party at the end with an absolute monster innings.
And still make 383 runs, which, Geoff, is our number for Tim Minchin on the way through. I know we're kind of shoehorning these numbers a little bit here this week, but that's the 0304. 2004, you know, it's a funny one, isn't it? Because he doesn't play the first 2 test matches, Baz. He comes back and makes runs in Mumbai at the home ground, low-scoring affair. They're important runs. Misses out at Nagpur. I think it's Gillespie again, isn't it, who knocks over Tendulkar at Nagpur early in the first innings with one that gets taken in the cordon by Damien Martin. So he doesn't actually make much of a mark in that series. So from an Australian perspective, there's so much made around 2004, but he missed half the series. So, I mean, I'm not saying it's cold comfort for Indian fans at all, or that it takes any shine off what Australia achieved over their final frontier and all the rest of it. But it is just a fact that Tendulkar wasn't there for half of it.
2004 is also the year India discovered what a tennis elbow is, because Tendulkar had a tennis elbow. Suddenly everybody started having a tennis elbow issue, regardless of what age you were, what gender. I had aunts showing up with tennis elbows. Honestly, I'm sure tennis elbows existed as an injury before that, but nobody knew about it before Tendulkar got a tennis elbow issue. And then in 2006, when he got the rotator cuff injury with the shoulder, that's when everybody suddenly he just brought even injuries into vogue during his time. And just a little note on that Sydney double 100, Sunandan Lele, our great friend's favorite story about how he gets a call from Sachin Tendulkar a couple of days before the Sydney test, and he says, "Can you please take me to Bowral? I just want to," because like he said, he wasn't getting that big score in that series. He just felt like he wanted a whiff of Bradman. So he goes to Bowral, allegedly, comes back and makes the double 100.
And it's not the last time he makes bulk runs at the Sydney Cricket Ground. So I'll press forward to 07, 08. We're getting towards the end of this most important period of his career. Although he is tapering off, and we'll come to this. We'll come to this later, I think, in a further answer. But 2006 is not a great year for Sachin Tendulkar, and 2007, India have a horrible World Cup. Don't even make it to the Super 8 stage.
Yeah.
They get bundled out in the groups. They come to Australia. He's kind of an elder statesman. He's 34, but he's not doesn't feel the same, Tendulkar, in 2007 as he did when he arrived in 2003. And, of course, sure enough, there it is, Sydney again. He makes the 100 there in 91, the 100 there in 2004. And to start 2008, unusual configuration of the series, playing the Sydney Test as second before Adelaide and Perth. And, that Sydney Test is completely overshadowed by other awful events, really. But 154 not out. 429 balls, didn't play a single cover drive across that marathon stay. 243 deliveries, not one of them was cover driven by Tendulkar. He made his mind up before that innings that he was going to make it an innings of resistance, and it completely worked. And he made another century in Adelaide to complete the series. He was player of the match in a high-scoring draw, 153 on day one. So that would be his penultimate trip to Australia. He made so many of them, as many as Colin Cowdrey. So back to 2008, we're back in India again. That's 4 test matches. I mentioned the 88 in Mohali. But Nagpur, new test venue, because they moved grounds by that point. Again, we kind of benchmarked that against Jason Frazier, but of course it's Tendulkar who wins the game, not Jason Frazier on the losing side. A century there, 109 and an average of 56 for the series. They don't come to Australia between then and their next home series against them in October 2010, and that's the 98 at Mohali. So the only time he was out in the 90s to Australia was in 2010. How out? Leg, but we've talked about 2 Mark Waugh dismissals. Out for 98, leg before wicket. Well, you know who it is, Brett. I'm sure you were there. Who did he play an ill-timed sweep off to get out for 98 at Mohali in 2010?
Oh, in Mohali, I covered the second test. Was it
part-time spinner? Marcus North. Marcus North.
Across
the line.
I remember Peter George getting him out in the second test in Bangalore. Umpire Peter George, I should say, but yeah.
Well, that's what comes next. So, the disappointment of 98 at Mohali backs it up at Bangalore with 215 in a very high-scoring game at Bengaluru. So his second double against the Australians after the 241 not at Sydney. So 6 doubles all up in Test cricket for him. And yes, Peter George, first Test wicket. The problem was that Tendulkar was on 215 at the time. So an average in the series in 2010 when he's back to his best up in the 130s. 11-12. Probably the less said, the better. Did make 72 at Melbourne and 80 at Sydney, but he only averaged 36, which for Tendulkar was on the lower side. And then 2013, his final series against Australia, playing in them across 22 years. Averaged 32, but did make 81 to start the series before Nathan Lyon bowled him through the gate. Said earlier that Mike Whitney's 64 now. Well, Nathan Lyon's, 3 decades younger than Whitney, and he was at the very start of his international journey at that particular point. Whitney debuting in 81 and Lyon debuting in 2011, 30 years later. So all told, 39 test matches, Tendulkar against Australia, 3,630 runs at 55, 11 centuries, 2 doubles, 16 half centuries on top of that. In Australia, an average of 53. There are not many foreign batsmen who've had an average of 50 plus over a long stretch of time. That was in 20 tests, so a pretty big sample size, 6 centuries, and an average at home against Australia of 57, with a further 500s, including that double at Bengaluru. That was the defining rivalry for Tendulkar, the one against Australia. There were great rivalries scattered throughout, but for how long it lasts, how many bowlers he was up against and dominated, the sheer volume of centuries in both international formats at the time, that's what I'll remember him most for.
There are not many players who faced both Mike Whitney and Glenn Maxwell in Test cricket, but Sachin Tendulkar did. Do you want to know something curious here? 3,630 runs against Australia, you said. Not quite the most ever. Jack Hobbs pipped him by 6 runs, 3,636. In fact, Tendulkar doesn't have the most runs against any country. There's no country against which he's got more test runs than anybody, but he's not the top of any of those lists. He's near the top of all of them, but he's not at the top of any of them, which I did find interesting. Now, we're only up to our third number, so I'm going to try to skip lightly through this, the condensed version.
I think the rest of the show is a light touch. We've all given long answers. Now time to go the brevity option, otherwise I'll get in trouble.
But this works beautifully because Michael Holden, who was on Storytime recently with a very detailed and cryptic number, he sent through this, and I love the work from Michael here. The number is $28.70, generous pledge, thank you, but it's also it also comes with this. He says, I've updated my nerd pledge using a random number generator to come up with a number that I don't believe has been covered before. There is only one instruction, which is swing. So this is an open field number. My number is 2870 or 287, depending how I want to try to interpret that. And I wanted to look at Sachin Tendulkar in World Cups. We've covered a little bit of this in what you were talking about, Adam, but it is notable that he played in 6 of the bloody things. 6
Bloody hell.
Cricket World Cups.
Is that Miandad played in 6 as well, Bharat?
He played in 6, yeah. He played, 6, ending in 96. They brought him back for the 96 World Cup.
Right. Well, so, Sachin, 1992, as we've discussed, oils ain't oils. He's not quite the finished article yet. He does make 350s, but, India beat Pakistan and Zimbabwe. Those are their only wins, 2 wins out of 8, and they're nowhere near it. 1996 is the one, the largely home World Cup. There are some matches in Sri Lanka as well, but, that's what should be Tendulkar's time. He makes 200s and 350s. His only failure is against Zimbabwe, which they win comfortably anyway. But it's also that era of India sort of wasting Tendulkar. You talked about the 90 against Australia. At the point that he gets out, he's made 90 out of 143. Like, he's just doing all the bloody work by himself. They're chasing 258, and as soon as he's out, the whole thing falls over. That's 90 off 84 balls as well. So he's rocketing along. They end up 16 runs short. 3 of his colleagues in the top order make 4 runs between them. I mean, he plays Sri Lanka twice. He makes 127 and 65, and India lose both games. The 100 at a runner ball, but Jayasuriya and Kalavattarana do one of their things and end up outscoring them. Beat Pakistan in the quarterfinals as per the norm. So that every World Cup in Tendulkar's era they have to beat Pakistan. That's how it goes. In the semi-final, his 65 is the only score of any substance, but they're still 98 for 1 when he gets out. And then there's the collapse at which they're 120 for 8 by the time the stadium starts being burned down and India forfeit the match. So he sets a World Cup tournament record, 523 runs there. 1999 is a much more sombre affair. His father dies during the tournament, so he plays in the first game. They lose to South Africa, and then he flies back to Mumbai for the funeral. Misses the defeat to Zimbabwe, so Zimbabwe knock off India by 3 runs. And then Tendulkar's back 4 days later for the Kenya game. He makes 140 not out, but that's his only big score of that tournament. India sort of stagger into the Super Sixes by beating England, who were no good at the time. But they lose to Australia and New Zealand. They finish last in the Super Sixes behind Zimbabwe. It's a pretty dire result. And there's that feeling that by 2003 he's really got a point to prove. He wants this now. He's had too many shortfalls, and he bashes up the small teams. Netherlands, Zimbabwe, and Namibia all get spifflicated by Tendulkar, but they get smashed by Australia, as you said. He top scores with 36, and then he kind of cranks up the momentum. So he's got the fast 50 against England in a big win. He's got the game against Pakistan where, exactly that. I just saw Bharat miming the shot. It's one that I remember watching live, and I remember it so vividly, the way that he cuts Shoaib Akhtar for 6 over backward point, the first over that Shoaib Akhtar bowls. Pakistan look good for this game. Syed Anwar makes a ton. They make 273. It's a big score. Their bowling attack, Waqar Younis, Wasim Akram, Shoaib Akhtar, Shahid Afridi, Abdul Razak. Not bad. Third ball drives Wasim Akram for 4. 7th ball is the cut shot of Shoaib for 6. Shoaib gets dragged out of the attack after 1 over, which is amazing in itself. Waqar Younis comes on, gets Sehwag and Ganguly out in consecutive deliveries, and the next ball Sachin faces from Waqar Younis, cover drive for 4. Next ball from Wasim Akram, cover drive for 4. Weird game. He gets his 50 with a 6 via 4 overthrows. He gets a thigh strain by the time he's in the 90s, and the runner comes out when he's on 98, and then he gets hurried up for the first time in the game. Short ball from Shoaib that he fends away into the gully, and he's out for 98. But 98 from 75 balls. They mow down the target. He makes 97 against Sri Lanka, 83 against Kenya in the semis. Before they play the final, he's already got 669 runs, and broken his own record for a World Cup. And as you said, against Australia in the final, the only hope when they're chasing 360. There's that story about him in the dressing room saying, all right, we need one boundary per over, and then we only need about 3.5 per over off the rest of it. Just easy. Think about it that way. But he tries to hit that boundary in the first over from McGrath and the top edge, the caught and bowled. And so that's the close one. That's the one that really hurts.
Doesn't he get about? Am I right in remembering? Doesn't he strike a boundary to start the innings in that chase? Yeah. I feel like he hits a nice boundary at the very beginning before out to the final ball of the first over.
Yeah.
From my memory, maybe it's a little pull shot. He plays a little tug pull shot away for 4. Is that right?
He gets out to the pull shot, I think, but he does get a boundary away before that. Yeah, he gets out for 4.
Yeah, he's 4 off not many. 2007, no good for anyone. 3 games and done. They lose 2 of them. I mean, they absolutely bash up Bermuda and make 400 against them, and he makes a 50, but lose to Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and they're out, and the World Cup format changes forever. So, like in 2011, Bharat, there's this real desperation around Indian cricket. The World Cup's in India. It's his last chance. Like, they can't, like, I think almost everybody can't stand the idea that he might end his career without actually winning one of these things, And there's kind of the feeling that the old curse is still going around, because so he makes 120 against England, better than a run a ball, and then they tie the game. Graham Swan somehow batting with Ajmal Shahzad, who hits a 6 in the last over. He makes 111 against South Africa, better than a run a ball, and they lose that game. 2 balls to spare. The South Africans scrape at home, 7 wickets down. So there's that thing of, Tendulkar's doing well and they still can't win those games. But the South Africa game's their only loss for the tournament. They get into the quarters against Australia, and I think that's the exercising of the ghosts there, because they finally see a Ponting team get knocked out of a World Cup. Yeah. He makes 53, anchoring the chase. Into the semis against Pakistan. They've got the great record against Pakistan. He makes 85, hold them well short in the chase. And it's probably a bit hard in mouth for the final, where they're 2 down for 31. Sehwag out, Tendulkar out cheaply, chasing 275. But that's the next generation coming through. You've got Dhoni, Kohli, having an important influence, Yuvraj Singh as well. Those 3 between them basically running the chase and taking it home. So this might bring us back to Michael Holden and his 28.7. Why would 28.7 be our no pledge number? Well, okay, so he made 673 runs in the World Cup in 2003. That was the record, sure, but he had 11 innings that time around. So I think you could argue that his best World Cup is still 1996 individually. That's when he's most dominant. 287 is our number. He made 2 tons and he averaged 87 in that World Cup.
Oh, beautiful. On the 2011 World Cup, you're right about it. There was a feeling of that curse never leaving. Because after the first 3 games, they'd won the first game, the tied, and then a loss to South Africa. So India's campaign was going nowhere. And there was this feeling around the team. I've spoken to a lot of them who were part of that squad, that we have to do it for Sachin. So that became a driving force, which is why once India do win the World Cup, you'll remember the famous picture of Virat Kohli and Suresh Raina carrying Sachin Tendulkar around the Wankhede. And Virat Kohli actually saying it. I mean, even in 2011, he knew what the right thing to say was, that we did it for Sachin. And there's this famous story of him from the 2011 World Cup semi-final where you'll remember, much like Ahmedabad, which we experienced, you had the prime ministers of both countries attending that game. So we had to get to the ground at 5:45 for a 9:30 a.m. test match start. Back in 2011, everybody showed up. The players had to come early. The food doesn't arrive. So the Indian players are kind of starving after the first innings when they have to go back in and defend the total. And there are a couple of them who are just, a little grumpy about not having eaten anything. And only Sachin Tendulkar stands up and says, have you come here to eat, or have you come here to win India, Pakistan, a semi-final, World Cup semi-final against Pakistan? And everybody's like, whoa, all right, Sachin's angry. So we all go out there and they win it for him.
Adam, you have the next number coming up. It is coming in from Terry Hogan, and it is $7 flat. So it's 700. You're away.
Yeah, I'm going to cut straight to the car chase here. Like, I think we should reflect on the end of Sachin's career, like the last purple patch, because, I kind of touched on it in my previous answer that, in a way, there is, I think, it's misremembered that he hits this extraordinary peak. It's a slow decline, and the last few years, is neither here nor there. When in fact there's one more rise to there's one more summit, if you like, and that's 2010, which is when he's already at this stage. What is he by then? He's 37. I think that would be right in saying if he turns 50 this year. When he hits more runs than any other test year, 1,562 test runs, and an average of 78 with 7 tons and 550s, that deep into his 30s. So for Terry Hogan's number 7, I'm going to go with the 7 centuries that year.
Nice.
I don't know whether he was written off at that point, Brad. I don't remember quite so well. I've said on the show before that there's a bit of a window in all of the sort of the cricketing history that I have been able to. In all the cricket I've followed, the one time I'm not so crash hot is between about 2008 and 2012. I drop off a little bit there. Maybe 2008, 2010 actually. So I don't remember an awful lot about those 2 tours that Australia made to India through there, for example, whereas I can tell you chapter and verse about 2001 and 2004 by way of comparison. But yeah, going through here, he makes loads of runs against South Africa. There's the aforementioned 215 against Australia when he has that average in the 130s in that series. And it's like he gives himself one last big run up. And I'm not sure whether the individual milestone of 100 hundreds was being spoken about loads during 2010 or whether that is a little bit more a sort of 2011, 2012 phenomenon. But nevertheless, this is when he got on the charge one last time.
Oh, it had already started by 2010. I think the 100 phenomena. I remember covering a test match, India-New Zealand in Nagpur, where, speaking of debutants who got Tendulkar out, Andy McKay, this unknown left-arm seamer with a receding hairline. I don't think he played a test match after that. He plays one test match, gets Tendulkar out, and overnight I remember a lot of nerves in the cricket press box, in the Nagpur press box. We were like, ooh, we have to write about Sachin's 100. We didn't realize that we would be in that position for 18 more months. But going back to your question of, was there a period where people had written Sachin Tendulkar off? There's that really infamous headline in the Times of India in 2006 where it said Endulkar, and also that moment in the 2006 loss to England, the famous Johnny Cash Ring of Fire test match where Sachin Tendulkar was booed at the Wankhede Stadium, and it was a eerie feeling. I was there, I wasn't doing the booing, trust me, but it was weird to see Sachin Tendulkar walk off at the Wankhede and him being booed. So people had started to turn on him, but it didn't last for too long.
Yeah, I mean, not many players have the latitude to go through an entire year in Test cricket making one half century, as he did in 2006. He averaged 24, so it wasn't a complete disaster. But when we see players have those, he had obviously so many credits in the bank, but he'd been playing for 17 years. It's not unreasonable to think Tendulkar in 2006 is just naturally reaching the end, like that natural decline we speak of, Geoff, from time to time with players who and it's fine. Like, it's not, I get that there's often nasty headlines that come with that with all-time greats, but who's to think that the career at that point goes another 7 years is I suppose the argument I'm mounting here. And he's back not quite to his best in 2007, but a couple of test tons averaging 55. 2008. Over 1,000 test runs again for the first time in a while, and then the aforementioned 2010. His real decline, he's 12-13. The substantial drop off when if he had his time again, no, he wouldn't have pulled the pin, would he? Because he wouldn't have got to 100 hundreds. But that's when you see the numbers torpor. It's well beyond that last bit. So it's closer to the age of sort of 40 than it is the age of 35-36.
And he wouldn't have got to 200 test matches either. You know, that was
Exactly.
a big part of the driver. You know, there's that sort of specially scheduled 2-match series against the West Indies just to make sure that he gets from 198 to 200. And if you remember, they plan the planes that are supposed to fly over on day 4 and dump rose petals onto the ground.
Yep.
But they polished off the West Indies in 3 days. And so
3 days.
the planes never actually got to make the trip. I don't know what happened to all the rose petals. But yeah, I think it was, from my memory, it doesn't quite overlap, but it was a bit concurrent with Rail Drive It as well. It was like, here's this generation of older players. They're all starting to fade. They're all getting less consistent. And so any of them would be blamed for the failures of any of the others. They were sort of lumped in together in that way, a bit like the Broad and Anderson thing. Well, you know, if Anderson's over 40, then so is Broad, even though he's years younger. So there was that impatience to hurry up and finish it off. And then, you know, 2010 is when it really hots up. And one of my favourite series ever is that South Africa-India series when Tendulkar and Dale Steyn just go absolutely toe-to-toe. You know, Dale Steyn bowls, it was one of the greatest test match bowling performances I've ever seen, when it's a baking hot day, it's blue sky, there's no cloud cover or anything, and he's just getting the ball to swing like venomously. You know, there's one that gets Pujara out and it swings in on middle, hits the seam, cuts away, hits the top of off stump, unplayable stuff. And Tendulkar's playing it so late with such soft hands. He's reading the swing, he's playing the movement off the pitch, he's playing everything away through sort of cover point and so on with an open face. It's just extraordinary, the display of skill versus skill, those two going against each other.
And that comparison again, right? I grew up in a time when I was in school, the big rivalry when India played South Africa was Tendulkar versus Alan Donald. Like, Alan Donald had been bowling coach for some 8 years by the time Tendulkar took on Dale Steyn in 2010. So again, that longevity, when you talk about Tendulkar and rivalries, you can't just talk about individuals. You have to talk about generational rivalries, right? So there was a rivalry against Donald and the one against Steyn, and you're absolutely right. And 2010 was also a crucial period in terms of his rivalry with Ponting. There was this big concern in India about Ricky Ponting scoring a lot of runs and potentially getting very close to Sachin Tendulkar's century record and test runs and all of that. But then he starts tapering off and Tendulkar really kicks on and creates that massive divide between him and Ponting and Zach Callis as well.
All right, we have one more number to go, and it is in your hands, Bharat. It comes in from Dan Walsh. This is actually a resuscitated number. This came in quite a long time ago, but for our purposes, it was going to work. So Dan Walsh, you get another dance around the floor. The number is $5.47. Over to you.
Oh, I'm really excited about this number. But before we even get to the number, let's go back in time. Rewind to Sachin Tendulkar before his first ever tour of Australia, the one that Adam spoke about so beautifully some time back. So there's this beautiful, cute interview where Sachin Tendulkar is sitting in a hot hotel lobby and he says, yeah, I'm ready for Australia. I've seen a lot of video cassettes of Australia and I know what the pitches are doing. He was watching video cassettes. He was around making his entry into Test cricket when video cassettes were still around. You guys remember what video cassettes are, right? A lot of people listening to this might not know what a video cassette is or what it looks like. So Sachin Tendulkar's career spanned the era of peak video cassettes in the late 80s and early 90s to video analysts in 2013, and not just one, so many multiple video analysts. And it also spanned like so many things. So many Indians were born, went to school, got married and had children in the time Sachin Tendulkar went from test debut to his final test at the Wankhede. And, you know, a lot of things have been said about Sachin Tendulkar and his relationship to India. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say he was the pulse of India for that crucial period in the history of India as a country. Because 1990s is when India opens up. He's 18 when liberalization happens, globalization happens. He's making his test debut, like I said earlier, when color TVs are coming into India. India is opening up as a country, being a market where you can bring in products like Coca-Cola and all these other brands. Because for nearly 10 years, all that had gone away. Nobody really looked at India as a market where you wanted to be as an international brand. But that changes, and Tendulkar is the face of it. I mean, that face of Tendulkar sold money. And it didn't have to wait for him to become this demigod. It started off pretty early. I mean, Boost is the Secret of My Energy was the first ad that really kind of warmed everyone's hearts towards Sachin Tendulkar. He becomes this brand ambassador for a chocolate drink called Boost. It's like Bonvita. Not long after, he starts talking about Visa Power. The first credit cards start coming into India, and who's the face of it? It's Tendulkar. And then Pepsi and Tendulkar, that relationship starts, and throughout his time as an Indian cricketer till 2006-07, when Pepsi move on from Sachin Tendulkar saying, no, this is the time for Youngistan, which is time for young cricketers, and Coca-Cola obviously signed him up for double the amount immediately. He's the face of every Pepsi campaign. And each Pepsi campaign kind of represents where India was in terms of a global perspective, not just in terms of cricket, but in terms of everything that was happening in India. And I think what really stood out for Tendulkar and why he was that constant is he never changed. I was thinking about it, except that very weird phase of his in the 1906 England tour right after it, where he sported this stud in his ear, which like people were like, wait, what is Sachin Tendulkar trying to do here? And he did away with it in a couple of months. He just was the same Sachin Tendulkar, right? There was something very pristine about him. There was something very or like I said earlier, even when everything else was going to shit, there were riots and everything else, there was still Sachin Tendulkar. When Sachin Tendulkar was batting, it was believed that nothing bad could go or nothing wrong could happen anywhere else in India.
You used to hear these stories, Brat, in the late 90s and early 2000s where he would get into his sports car at 3 a.m. and drive the streets of Mumbai because of the sheer weight of celebrity. There was no other time that he could be out in the community. Can you give us a sense of that life he had behind closed doors? I mean, I know we've touched on this a little bit already, but being Sachin Tendulkar in his hometown, what it was like. From being, I mean, I guess he was a little boy, wasn't he, when it was foretold that he was going to be a superstar? You've already explained that.
Yeah.
But teenage sensation, 24-year career, and what he's doing now post-cricket, that he has led a life where he's had to be quite restricted in how he goes about it.
He's not led a normal life because his success never allowed him to lead a normal life, right? He became the first ever major cricketing celebrity in India. And the late 80s were also an interesting time in terms of where Bollywood was. Because right at the start of the 80s, it was the Amitabh Bachchan era. I mean, Amitabh Bachchan is still on television, as we noticed while we were in India. But there was an era. I mean, there's a Rajesh Khanna era in the 1970s, the chocolate boy hero. And then the angry young man, Amitabh Bachchan, steals the stage. And for 6 or 7 years, he was untouchable. But then, towards the end of the 80s, there were no real major cricketing stars coming through the ranks. I mean, Gavaskar was retiring, Kapil Dev was around, but he kind of started tapering off. Dilip Vengsarkar was also, I mean, arguably the best Mumbai batter in between Gavaskar's generation and Tendulkar's generation. He was aging. Ravi Shastri was the only debonair personality around. But then India and Indian cricket needed that one big breakout star. It happened to be this 15, 16-year-old child with the curly locks. And he just won India over immediately. Like that performance in Pakistan with the broken nose or the nose that was bleeding. His performances in Australia. And from that point on, he couldn't go anywhere without being mobbed. So you're right about him driving his car at 3 a.m. So many stories of him calling up movie theaters and saying, I want to watch a movie, because he wanted to live a normal life. Like Sachin Tendulkar, the person, is a very curious person. The first thing he wanted to do after he retired, he said, I've never experienced a white Christmas. I've always been playing cricket in the southern hemisphere at that time. So he goes to England to experience a white Christmas. He goes to Iceland. So he, a lot like Virat Kohli, has always been a curious individual. So, but he was never allowed to lead, forget about a normal life. We speak of bubbles now in the COVID era. That was a different kind of bubble. And, that kind of impacted his personal life, I'm sure. But it also kind of built or added to the aura and the brand value as his career developed.
So why do you think he still lives in Mumbai? If he's basically in a palace, but walled up in there most of the time. I mean, it's interesting, I think, that he never got into commentary or did those kind of retired player jobs. I mean, I guess he had enough money, but a lot of the players who also have enough money like doing it for the relevance. They like to be on TV, all the rest of it. He doesn't need that. He's stayed away from doing that for the most part. Why live in Mumbai if you can't actually live in Mumbai?
I think it just has a lot to do with how much Mumbai has meant to him, right? He comes from a middle class family in Bandra, and he still lives in Bandra. He's gone from Bandra East to Bandra West. But even before he moved into this palatial home, which I have a beautiful story about when we speak about the other Tendulkar who's burst onto the scene before this podcast is over. But the palatial home he moved into in 2011, it's not too far away from the other house where he was near the water. But you're right. I mean, it is Bombay, but it's not Bombay because the walls are so high. Nobody can see into the Tendulkar mansion or the Tendulkar compound, even though there are buildings on either side. But I think it's just his loyalty to the city, and it also kind of he in a weird way, he was an uncomfortable celebrity. You see his interviews over the years. Now he's become really confident. I think he's got the freedom of not having to worry about cricket or anything at all, to be honest. He's earned for the next 18 generations. But I don't think he really needed to do commentary or do any of these other jobs. He knew he could always be a mentor, which he still is with the Mumbai Indians, or whatever Tendulkar wanted it to be, he could be, right? So that's the level you reach. And that's also India in a nutshell. In India, whatever you do, not many people can do it, but once you go beyond a level, it's up to you, really. I mean, you get whatever you want. And Tendulkar breached that level very, very soon in life, which kind of reflects in the brand, the market that Tendulkar built around him. And some of the numbers are out of this world. And the man who played a big role in his life was introduced to him by Ravi Shastri's the late Mark Mascarenhas, who's this great cricket fan and a big Tendulkar fan, and who used to be Ravi Shastri's friend. And he introduces Tendulkar and tells, or Mark Mascarenhas is interested in Tendulkar, and he says, you know what, cricket's it's not just a sport. It's not just about being paid 7,000 rupees, which is what Tendulkar was paid to play that first test match, or test series, by the way, per game. You bring so much to this country. You bring so much to everyone around you. Your brand value needs to grow. And he signs him up for, I did the conversion to Australian currency. So in 1995, Sachin Tendulkar is signed up by Mark Mascarenhas for what would be 8.2 million Australian dollars, which is a significant amount. You've gone from earning 7,000 rupees for a test match in 89 to getting a contract of 45 crore in 95. I don't even know how many times into how many that growth is in just the space of 6 years. And in 2001, he's re-signed for 18.3 million Australian dollars. And in 2006, that figure's gone up to 33 million. And whatever Sachin Tendulkar touched, obviously, turned into gold, which is why all these brands always wanted him to be their face. And because the face never changed, they could use that Tendulkar image, the Tendulkar persona, to sell whatever they wanted to sell. His voice, I think, also played a huge role in it, right? There was that innocence in his voice just because of how soft it was, and also the most mimicked voice in the history of India, I'm sure. And it also goes hand in hand with the rise of India in cricket, right? The 1996 World Cup, the Wilkes World Cup, and Jagmohan Dalmia suddenly rises to the fore. He starts bringing a lot of money into Indian cricket. India starts overtaking Australia and England as the leaders in world cricket and the ones who have the power. And it's built on the back of Sachin Tendulkar and what he's brought to world cricket.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying there. The way Harsh has explained it when we've interviewed him before is that the rise of Indian cricket in the 90s, and partly the rivalry with Australia, relates to the opening up of the economy and the early 90s, that story that we've touched on briefly earlier, and the current domination of India in world cricket is reflected in the 10 years that Kohli's been at the top, which does cross over with Tendulkar, but they're separate tales. There's one where India go from being, it might be an apocryphal story, but the idea of the tied tests being taped over for a table tennis tournament on Doordarshan, and like where they were in terms of rivalries around the world, and kind of considered a secondary nation, having won the 83 World Cup, acknowledging that, but not treated as the main game. To the end of the 90s and the end of the 2010s, it's all about India, and that spans the Tendulkar career, and what he's laid the foundation for with what's happens next is staggering. I mean, to think that the world that Tendulkar lives in now is at age 50, and how different it is to the India that he lived in when he was, say, 18 or 21, when coming to maturity, that traditional age of reaching maturity, age 21, it may as well be a different planet.
Very much so. And India was so young as a country as well, right? When Sachin Tendulkar makes his debut, India is 42 years old, because India had the British ruling them, on the back of the Mughals ruling them. So for 7 or 8 centuries, there was no independent India, or completely independent India. So India is kind of finding its own identity, and at this point they find this multi-generational star in Sachin Tendulkar. So Tendulkar and India could just grow together, and it's hyped. It has been hyped over the years, and people say that a lot. But having lived in India through the 90s and 2000s, it really would make a difference. Like I said earlier, whatever else was happening in India politically, or if there's a financial crisis or whatever, till the time Sachin Tendulkar had a bat in his hand, there was just this warmth. It was the safety blanket that India needed for the longest time. But another thing, and this is more personal, I always appreciated about Sachin Tendulkar was his taste in music. And going back to all the advertisements I spoke about, there's this one really early one in the early 90s when it's to do with I think a stereo, must have been a Philips or one of those, where someone asks him, so what kind of music do you listen to? He says Kishore Kumar, and also Pink Floyd, and Dire Straits is my favorite brand. And for an Indian cricketer to start talking about Pink Floyd and Dire Straits was quite special, because at that point, India was again such a closed-off society, as I said. Western music didn't break through. Of course, Ravi Shastri used to listen to Body M in 1985, but that was the closest Indian cricket had come to embracing Western music. And for a young kid like Sachin Tendulkar, who's still finding his way in terms of being comfortable speaking English, to start talking about Dire Straits and Pink Floyd was like, it kind of opened up the rest of India to Dire Straits and Pink Floyd. And in latter years, of course, Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits and Sachin Tendulkar have become really good friends. There was this episode of Harsha Unplugged in the mid-2000s. I remember the first time Mark Knopfler actually calls, Star Sports had organized it, and calls and speaks to Sachin Tendulkar on the phone. And you could see Tendulkar is like a fanboy. He's having a fanboy moment. Then they meet in 2005, where I think Knopfler gives him a Fender guitar, and Tendulkar gives him a cricket bat. And then I think again in 2019, Knopfler and his partner visited Tendulkar's house, and again you can see him bubbling with excitement in his Instagram post. He just starts talking, naming all the Dire Straits songs in his Instagram post. That's Sachin Tendulkar. And why do I bring Mark Knopfler, and why do I bring Sachin Tendulkar here? This brings me to my greatest Nerd Pledge answer ever, and I can just drop the Nerd Pledge number here and walk away. If this is the last time I'm on Storytime, I couldn't have been prouder of what I've achieved, because Dan Walsh is 5.47. What is 5.47? That's the running time of Sachin Tendulkar's favorite Dire Straits song, Sultans of Swing, or Sultans of Swing, whichever way you want to call it. And what was Sachin Tendulkar's away test average over 200 tests? 54.7. I rest my case.
Nothing but net. That's perfect. That's perfect. And that I think that has taken us to where we needed to go, from baby Sachin through to Sachin, the cultural phenomenon that continues, and who knows how many more decades there will be of Brian Lara steel drum videos and Mark Knopfler Instagram posts and all of the other joys that we get from SRT.
From baby Sachin to Sachin baby, if you like, in terms of the cultural influence
and
over cricket and cricketers.
To baby Sachin, to Sachin Tendulkar, who's taken the first steps playing for Mumbai Indians in the IPL over the last couple of weeks. So it feels like it is time for the next wheel of Tendulkar to turn and the next Tendulkar to have his moment. I don't think it'll be 24 years long, but I hope it's at least 24 months. I think we've done what we came to do. It is the birthday of Sachin Tendulkar, and it was a time to talk about it, and we've done it. I mean, this may be one of our longer ever episodes, but the guy played 200 test matches.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
if you do 2 hours of podcast, that's about 40 seconds per test match, and that's not even counting the one-day internationals. So Adam Collins, Bharat Sundaresan, thank you for joining me for this special episode of Story Time, a particular one, and thank you, Raul Venkat, for coming up with the idea. This has been The Final Word. If you want to play Nerd Pledge, the game that notionally helped build this episode, you go to patreon.com/thefinalword, and that means you can help us keep making the show. You put in your name, you put in your number, and you can be part of the fun. And I think we shall leave it there. From The Final Word, for this week at least, let us say, happy birthday, Sachin.